So I want you to picture the scene in Providence, Rhode Island. It's the afternoon of December 13th, 2025. It's about 4:05 p.m. And inside this huge modern engineering building at Brown University, an institution with 260 years of history, students are just focused. It's quiet. It's final season.
Right. It's the absolute picture of an elite American academic sanctuary, a place you're supposed to feel completely safe.
And then that whole illusion is just shattered in a matter of seconds.
Yeah.
Over 40 rounds of 9mm gunfire.
Yeah.
That quiet, scholarly atmosphere just turns into a scene of, absolute chaos and violence.
And when it was over, the immediate toll was just horrific. 2 young people dead, 9 others wounded.
And just like that, Brown University's long, storied history gets this awful, grim new footnote in the chapter of American campus violence.
The facts came together pretty quickly from the investigators. The suspect was identified as Benjamin Erickson. He was 24 years old.
A former military member, I saw.
That's right. A recently retired Army specialist in E4.
And they tracked him down pretty quickly, right?
They did, yeah. They found him hours later at a hotel in Coventry, which isn't far from campus. And he had the weapon with him.
The handgun.
The handgun, but It was equipped with what the sources call a military-grade laser aiming device, plus several high-capacity magazines.
Okay, so let's really unpack this, because this deep dive today, it's not just going to be a grim retelling of what happened.
No.
Our mission here is to look at all the source material, the reports, the data, the analysis, and really examine how 3 sort of huge systemic failures in the U.S. all collided right there at that one spot at Brown.
That is the critical point. We are looking at a triple crisis. First, you have this completely neglected mental health crisis among our veterans. That created the high-risk individual.
That's one.
Then you have the structural dilemma that, frankly, every single university is facing. How do you balance that ideal of campus openness with the very real need for physical security?
Especially in a country with so many guns. And that brings us to the third one.
Exactly. The third failure. The persistent, just paralyzing political deadlock over gun control, fueled by this intense polarization. This event wasn't an anomaly.
No.
The sources all confirm this. It was a symptom, a devastating one. So our job here is to connect those dots for you, to go beyond the headlines and show the institutional breakdowns that made this tragedy, in hindsight, tragically predictable.
Okay, so let's dive right into that first core failure. The suspect's background as an Army veteran. This immediately raises a flag for a problem that, we've known about for a long time, but often seem to ignore.
We do. It's this unique and sometimes incredibly dangerous pathway from military service back into a very fragmented civilian life.
And what's really striking in the documents you see is the cold, hard data that links veterans to mass violence. It just highlights this severe support gap that the country seems unable or unwilling to fix.
And we're not just talking about anecdotes here. The data, when you look at it over the last couple of decades, it's profoundly troubling.
So let's start with what I thought was the most arresting statistic in the sources. The one about mass shooters themselves.
Right.
The data says that 32% of all male mass shooting perpetrators under the age of 60 are retired from the military.
32%. That number should just stop everyone in their tracks.
It's a huge number.
Yeah.
But you have to put it in context, right?
You absolutely have to. To really grasp the gravity, you have to realize that retired military men in that age group are a tiny fraction of the total U.S. male population.
So for them to be almost a third of all shooters?
It means their statistical probability of committing one of these acts is more than double that of the general male population. So this isn't random. It's a clear, elevated risk factor that demands a targeted response that just isn't there.
And when you look into the why behind that risk, the reason cited in the sources, it starts to make this kind of awful, tragic sense.
It does. It connects directly back to the unique psychological burdens we place on soldiers. We talk a lot about PTSD, and that's obviously a huge part of it. But there are also traumatic brain injuries, TBIs, which can mess with impulse control. And then there's something called moral injury.
Explain that for us.
Moral injury it's the wound you get from doing something or seeing something that violates your deepest moral beliefs. And that can happen a lot in these long, ambiguous conflicts.
And then you throw in the shock of coming home.
The transition shock is huge. You leave this life of intense structure where your entire identity is soldier, and you're dropped into this isolating civilian world with no clear mission. That void, when it's combined with those deep psychological wounds, can be a catalyst for violence, often inward, but sometimes.
Sometimes outward, like at Brown.
Exactly. And this risk is tied directly to the second piece of the puzzle. Lethal means access to weapons. I mean, the crisis of veteran suicide is like a horrifying prologue to mass violence.
It's a hidden war, really, fought here at home. The sources lay out the numbers between 2002 and 2021. Nearly 87,000 veterans died by gun suicide.
87,000. To put that number in perspective,
Just staggering.
it's approximately 16 times the number of American soldiers killed on the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan during that exact same period.
Wow.
So that tells you where the real sustained crisis is. And the method is key. 70% of those suicides are with a firearm. It shows what happens when a psychological crisis meets professional-level access to deadly tools. The outcome is fast and it's final.
And that's the thing, right? The military is designed, by its very nature, to train people to be incredibly efficient with weapons.
Yes.
So that culture of proficiency, combined with the freedoms of civilian life, it means the tools for extreme violence are always right there.
And the statistics on gun access among veterans are they're alarming. The sources say the average armed veteran owns 6 firearms.
6, not 1 or 2, 6. That's so much higher than the average gun owner.
It is. And it's not just that they own more, they also have the professional training to use them with maximum effectiveness.
And then there's the storage issue, which seems to be the final piece that turns potential into tragedy.
It's the critical link. The data shows 1/3 of armed veterans store at least one of their guns loaded and unlocked.
1/3.
Yeah. And in a moment of crisis, that tiny bit of time, the time it takes to find a key or open a safe or load a magazine, that can be the only thing that stops an impulsive act. When you remove that barrier, the risk just skyrockets.
And we saw this play out with the specifics of the Brown shooting. I mean, the gear itself tells a story. You mentioned that laser sight.
Yes, the military-grade laser aiming device. This isn't your standard accessory from a sporting goods store. This for high-precision, maximum lethality deployment. It points to advanced tactical training.
So the shooter, Erickson,
Yeah.
an E4 specialist, what does that rank tell us?
An E4 specialist is often someone with a lot of hands-on, high-level training, but they're also in the age group that's most vulnerable to the pressures of combat in this difficult transition home.
So you get this incredibly dangerous combination.
You do. It's the professional military know-how, how to use accessories, how to be lethally accurate, mixed with the completely unregulated ease of civilian gun access. Military expertise is leaking into the civilian violence space.
So the why behind this just points right back to that psychological support gap. Erickson had known issues, but the system still failed him.
The systemic failure here is absolute. Every potential point of intervention failed. University counseling centers, even at a place like Brown, are completely overwhelmed. They can barely handle the normal stress of student life.
Let alone a high-risk individual from outside the student body. And for veterans, it's so much worse.
It's a labyrinth. You leave the most structured system on Earth, and you're supposed to navigate the VA, which is often slow and bureaucratic, and then coordinate that with community mental health services, which are underfunded.
So what it all boils down to is a lack of any effective centralized channel for these guys to decompress and reintegrate.
That's the core of it. The sources are basically painting a picture of a system that creates a lethal recipe for people like Erickson. You give them professional training, instant access to guns, isolation, and untreated trauma. When you put all that together, the violence was less a question of if and more a question of when and where.
It's not that veterans are inherently violent.
Not at all.
It's that the system fails its promise to them. And when that happens, as we saw at Brown, that highly trained individual can become a lethal threat to everyone.
Okay, so we've established the threat coming to the university. Now let's pivot to why Brown, an elite, well-funded campus that spends millions on security. Why it couldn't stop that threat.
This is the part that is just baffling. I mean, here's an institution that's on the cutting edge of everything, but it had this fundamental, almost primitive security vulnerability.
And when you look at the bigger picture, this tragedy really exposes that structural conflict inside every American university. It does. It's this deep tension between the ideal of academic freedom and openness and the cold reality of needing physical protection in a society saturated with guns. It's a paradox that's proving to be fatal.
So let's talk about the exact location. The shooting was in the engineering building, a central academic hub.
Right, and the sources are very clear on this point. At the time of the shooting, the exterior doors to that building were unlocked.
Unlocked. Why?
It was a deliberate choice. It was a direct manifestation of the university's philosophy of academic openness.
Can you explain what that means in practical terms?
Well, historically, it's this idea of the university as a public space, a place for the free exchange of ideas, where the community is welcome. It's an ideological stance against becoming a fortress.
The noble idea.
A noble idea, but it's one that is functionally, and I would argue, legally outdated in 21st century America. It allowed Erickson to just walk right in with no barriers into a dense target area.
And this wasn't for a lack of resources. Brown spends millions every year on security. They have armed campus police, hundreds of cameras, a mandatory keycard system for all the dorms.
The irony is just crushing. You have this massive investment in security infrastructure, but it was all made irrelevant by one single unlocked door.
So all those cameras and keycards.
They're preventative measures. But if the fundamental design of the campus prioritizes this abstract idea of openness over physical security, then the resources are, in a way, wasted. The sources frame this as a catastrophic failure of institutional design.
And that failure then just compounded the chaos of the emergency response itself.
It did. The Brown Alert System, their mass notification protocol, was actually activated very quickly, within 2 minutes of the first shots.
But speed wasn't enough.
No. Speed alone doesn't prevent confusion. And the sources detail these specific failures that just amplified the terror. First, some students in the dorm said they never got clear instructions on what to do.
So they were just left to figure it out on their own, in a panic.
Exactly. And then there was the false report.
Ah, right. The one claiming the suspect had been detained. How damaging was that?
Highly damaging. In a moment of extreme stress, you need absolute certainty from the authorities. When a false all clear is given, even for a moment, it shatters trust in the system. People start to second-guess everything.
And the human cost of that sustained confusion and fear was just staggering. Students were hiding for nearly 15 hours.
15 hours. You have to really think about what that means. It's not just the initial terror. It's the grinding psychological trauma of not knowing what's happening. No food, no water, just hiding under a desk in the dark. That kind of prolonged stress guarantees long-term psychological fallout.
And there's one story from the sources, one specific anecdote that just drives home how inescapable this has all become. The story of Zoe Weissman.
Yeah. Zoe was a sophomore at Brown, and she was also a survivor of the 2018 Parkland High School shooting.
So she survived one school shooting as a child.
Only to face the exact same terror again years later, thousands of miles away, at an Ivy League university she thought would be a safe haven.
That is just a devastating indictment of our society. Her quote really says it all.
It does. She said, "Congress's inaction is tearing our childhoods apart with gunfire." Her experience connects the personal horror of that day directly to the systemic failure to regulate the weapons that cause it.
And her story shows how this has become normalized. This isn't a Brown problem, it's an American education problem.
The numbers confirm it. In 2025 alone, the sources say there were at least 75 school shootings in the U.S., and 43 of those were at universities.
43. We focus so much on K-12, but colleges are clearly a major battleground.
Over the past decade, more than 200 shootings on college campuses. And then you have the single most grim statistic of all.
That gun violence is now the leading cause of death for American children.
More than car accidents, more than disease, gunfire. And this defines the paradox of modern education. Active shooter drills are as normal as fire drills. Students have to learn evasion techniques alongside calculus. The American university has devolved from a sanctuary into a reflection of society's deep-seated security crisis.
We're just trying to build higher walls around the schools.
Right. While completely ignoring the rising tide of weapons just outside those walls, the institutional response is all reactive. It fails to address the core problem.
Okay, so that leads us directly into the political landscape.
Okay.
The third systemic failure. And this is the one that feels the most stuck.
It's arguably the most intractable, yeah.
Rhode Island, where Brown is, has some of the country's stricter gun laws. They have background checks, a 7-day waiting period, and yet Erickson was still heavily armed.
And that right there demonstrates the profound limits of any state-level reform. It raises this critical question of a state's efforts just hitting a brick wall against a polarized national system.
The sources called it gun tourism.
Gun tourism. It's the perfect term. Rhode Island puts up a fence, a 7-day waiting period, a background check. But if a neighboring state like New Hampshire allows you to buy a gun in a private sale with no checks, that fence becomes meaningless.
So you just drive across the border.
You drive across the border. And the sources confirm that the firearms Erickson had were traced through this exact cross-state circulation chain. He exploited the weakest link in the region to bypass Rhode Island's laws.
So without federal standards, any state trying to protect its citizens is basically held hostage by the state with the loosest laws.
It's a classic tragedy of the commons. The lowest common denominator sets the safety level for everyone else.
And this is all amplified by the sheer volume of weapons in the country.
You have to quantify it to really understand. The sources state we have about 330 million people in the U.S., but over 400 million civilian firearms.
More guns than people.
More guns than people. That drastically lowers the threshold for violence.
And it connects right back to campus shootings. The data shows 75% of school shooters get their weapons from their own homes.
From their own home or a close relative's home. This isn't some sophisticated black market deal. It's about proximity and easy access.
And that access creates this huge domestic risk.
A massive one. The data says 4.6 million American children live in homes where guns are stored, loaded, and unlocked.
4.6 million.
It's an enormous population of kids with instant, unsupervised access to lethal weapons. The home is essentially serving as an unregulated armory for the school violence epidemic.
And despite all this data, despite polls showing most Americans want stricter laws, there's just political inertia.
It's total inertia. And it's driven by the immense power of lobbying groups and the political polarization in Congress. Federal reform efforts are just derailed again and again.
Even that 2022 bill, the one everyone called a huge breakthrough.
The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, it was touted as the most significant breakthrough in 30 years. And it did do some good things, like enhanced checks for buyers under 21.
But it wasn't enough.
No, because it was mostly focused on the flow of new sales. It did very little to address the hundreds of millions of guns already in circulation. The crisis has long since outpaced these incremental, politically safe reforms.
So when a tragedy like Brown happens, we fall into this painfully predictable, dysfunctional cycle.
It's like clockwork. The Democratic senators from Rhode Island immediately called for stronger federal laws.
And the Republicans
Emphasized protecting the Second Amendment, framing any new restriction as an infringement on liberty.
which confirms that cycle we always see. Mourning, then debate, then forgetting.
Exactly. The debate is polarized before the victims are even buried, which guarantees no consensus is ever reached. The political will just evaporates until the next one.
But the sources point out this one specific, incredibly ironic legislative setback.
I was hoping you'd bring that up. It's jaw-dropping, especially when you look at it through the lens of a veteran like Erickson.
This was the recent spending bill in the House of Representatives.
It was. And buried inside that bill was a provision that overturned a long-standing practice from the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Okay, break this down for us. What was the original practice?
The original rule was a safety valve. If the VA decided a veteran was so mentally incompetent that they needed someone else to manage their finances.
A fiduciary.
Right. If they needed a fiduciary, that automatically triggered a report to the National Background Check System, NICS. The logic was, if you're not mentally capable of managing your own money, you shouldn't be able to buy a gun.
That seems like common sense. So why was it overturned?
Because lawmakers, often allied with gun rights groups, argued it was a violation of veterans' Second Amendment rights without due process. They claimed financial incompetence doesn't automatically equal dangerousness.
But the irony is it's staggering. In the wake of a shooting committed by a veteran with documented mental health issues.
Congress was actively removing a tool designed to flag high-risk individuals from that exact same demographic.
It's not just failing to act.
It's actively making the problem worse. It's a legislative choice that prioritizes a theoretical interpretation of rights over the very real demonstrated safety of the public.
So if this problem feels so uniquely American, what about other developed nations? How do they handle campus safety and gun violence? Sometimes looking abroad is the clearest mirror.
It really is, and the international examples in the sources show very clearly that this is not an unsolvable problem, it's a solvable one. They show that systematic design, combining strict gun control with real mental health care, can create a society where safety is the consensus.
Let's start with the UK. Their big change came after one horrific event, right? The Dunblane shooting in 1996.
That event galvanized the entire country. The government moved swiftly and passed extremely strict gun control laws, basically banning private ownership of most handguns.
And the result?
The sources are clear. The UK has not had a similar large-scale school shooting since. It's a direct correlation. You remove the specific tool of violence, and that specific type of violence stalks.
Then you have Japan, which is a totally different approach. It's much more comprehensive.
Japan's strategy has multiple layers. First, yes, a near-total ban on firearms. It is incredibly difficult to get a license. But they don't stop there. They also have mandatory, regular mental health screenings built into their society.
And the community plays a huge role.
A huge role. They have these really tight-knit community networks that act as an early warning system. If someone is acting erratically, the community gets involved, the system intervenes. It's that integration control, screening, and community support that keeps their violence rates so low.
Australia is another key example.
Right.
After the Port Arthur massacre in 1996,
They didn't just tweak the laws, they implemented a massive compulsory national buyback program for semi-automatic weapons. The government literally took hundreds of thousands of guns out of circulation.
yet it worked.
Immediately and measurably. Mass shootings and overall gun deaths plummeted. It proved that aggressively reducing the supply of these weapons directly increases public safety.
Which makes the American situation even more frustrating.
Yeah.
We have these proven models, these solutions that work.
And we can't adopt any of them. The comparison becomes really stark.
And it brings us right back to our triple crisis.
It does. The absolute interpretation of the Second Amendment acts as this legal shield. You combine that with legislative blockage from powerful interest groups and the deep social polarization. And these proven solutions become politically impossible here.
In the U.S., the whole debate is just locked on the right to bear arms. It completely overshadows the right to, live, to go to school without fear.
And that's why the tragedy at Brown, of all places, is so symbolic. This is an elite institution, a global brand with a massive endowment. But the violence found it just the same.
It shatters that illusion that money or status can buy you safety.
Exactly. It proves that the threat of gun violence in America is what the sources call undifferentiated. It doesn't care about your wealth, your GPA, or your social standing. As long as these systemic loopholes exist, everyone is equally vulnerable. The threat is universal. So you look at Brown's response now. They've canceled exams. They're doing a 6-month campus overhaul, upgrading their security systems.
And those are all necessary steps, of course.
They are. They're necessary to treat and restore a sense of safety, but at their core, they are still just treating the symptom, not the actual disease.
And this is where the sources become really clear. The path to a real long-term solution is not a mystery. It's just politically incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
We need fixes across all three of those failure points we've been talking about.
Let's start with gun control. The sources all emphasize that unified federal legislation is the only way. State laws just aren't enough.
So closing those gun tourism loopholes.
Closing the loopholes, mandating universal background checks for all sales, and implementing effective red flag laws nationwide so you can temporarily remove guns from people who a court deems a danger.
Okay, that's one. Second, the mental health investment, especially for veterans who are clearly being failed by the current system.
It has to be a massive, dedicated investment in high-quality mental health care for both veterans and students. And crucially, we have to create seamless communication between the VA, campus counseling centers, and community health providers. That fragmented system has to end.
And third, the campus itself. That balance between openness and safety.
Universities have to have a fundamental reevaluation of that doctrine. They have to move past cosmetic fixes like more cameras. The sources suggest prioritizing physical safety with things like standardized access control in core academic buildings. The policies have to reflect the reality of 2025, not some ideal from 1985.
And to do any of this, we have to move beyond the partisan feuds and the power of interest groups.
That's the precondition for any of it. The sources make it clear that real change only happens when there's a collective decision to place human life and safety above political calculation.
The Brown University shooting, happening so close to the end of the year. It feels like a final, tragic alarm bell. When a place of knowledge is violated like this, it forces the country to ask some really hard questions about what it values.
It does, about its identity and its commitment to the future.
And so, we'll leave you with the profound questions that the source material raises, something for you to think about on your own. When we talk about true national strength, what really defines it? Possessing the most firearms of any developed nation, or ensuring every single child can study safely in a classroom.
And what is true freedom in this context? The absolute right to bear arms, or the freedom from the paralyzing fear that those arms will be used against you or your children in a place that should be dedicated to growth.
Something for you to mull or explore on your own. We'll see you on the next deep dive.